The scene begins with a woman who is crying after waking up from a bad dream. Shortly after, we see three individuals, an elderly man named Edmund Tuttle, a young lady named Lydia who is unable to speak, and an older woman named Mrs. Bertha Mellis, standing at the door of a magnificent mansion. They have come to apply for the position of servants for the wealthy family who resides there. The reason for the job opening is that the previous servants have mysteriously disappeared, leaving the family in a lurch without any prior notice. These three applicants have come forward to fill the void and apply for the job. Despite the insistence of the new servants that they are familiar with the house, the wealthy madame is insistent on showing them around and making sure they understand the special rules she has put in place. She takes great care to lock every door they enter and ensures that the previous one is locked before opening a new one. The reason for her strict measures is that her children, Anne and Nicholas, suffer from a rare condition that makes them sensitive to sunlight. As a result, she maintains a perpetually dark house to protect them, and she begins by introducing the servants to her children and explaining the situation to them. Grace informed them that her husband had left and was dispatched to fight in war a year ago. She also mentioned that her children were suffering from a condition for which there was currently no cure. Despite these challenges, Grace allowed the three new servants to begin their work that day. Grace told Bertha that it was time for breakfast and instructed her to cook for the children in the kitchen. Anne and Nicholas, the children, seemed to enjoy engaging in sibling fights quite frequently. In order to have a private conversation, Grace asked Mrs. Mellis to step outside so that the children wouldn't overhear them. Grace then informed Mrs. Mellis that the job postings for helpers hadn't been collected by the mailman. She expressed curiosity about how or where they had found out that their household was in need of helpers. Mrs. Bertha Mellis disclosed that they had previously worked at that house and held a deep affection for the place. Grace, to her delight, was not bothered by this revelation. In fact, she was pleased to hear that the new servants were already familiar with the intricacies of the house. The family's usual routine involves Grace teaching her children Bible stories, as she values instilling biblical values in their upbringing. Aware that Anne and Nicholas cannot concentrate while studying together, Grace separates them and asks Anne to move to another room. After leaving the two children alone, Grace suddenly hears crying and rushes back to check on them. Assuming it was Nicholas, she soon realizes it wasn't him. When she questions Anne, Anne denies being the one crying and claims it was the other child. Grace becomes irritated whenever Anne tells stories about a child she sees, but Grace cannot. She believes Anne is making them up. Amidst their argument, Grace notices that the curtains in the rooms are open, which angers her even more. She confronts Bertha and Lydia, expressing her frustration that she had specifically instructed them not to leave the curtains open, as it could harm her children. Despite Lydia and Mrs. Mellis providing valid excuse, Grace remains deeply frustrated. During dinner, Nicholas questions Anne about whether she truly saw the boy and asserts that Victor, the boy she claims to see, isn't a ghost. Later, at bedtime, Anne wakes Nicholas up in the middle of the night to show him the open curtain. Anne insists that it wasn't her doing and blames Victor. Nicholas becomes extremely frightened. He cries of fear, which made Grace, their mom, extremely upset with Anne. Grace imposed a penance upon Anne, instructing her to immerse herself in biblical tales and compelling her to offer an apology for her perceived dishonesty. Anne insisted that she is telling the truth regarding Victor and the other individuals in their house, leading to an argument between her and her mother. Anne has been enduring Grace's punishment for 3 days, prompting Bertha to inquire about its duration. Mrs. Mellis exited the room, and Grace observed the chandelier trembling, noticing Bertha and Lydia outside the house. She wondered who is causing disturbances upstairs. She went to see Anne in the staircase and noticed that Anne was engrossed in her readings. Grace asked Anne if she had heard the noise coming from upstairs earlier. Anne hesitated to tell her mother, recalling that she had received punishment when she tried to tell the truth. However, Grace pleaded with her, and Anne reluctantly directed her to the junk room. Despite feeling scared, Grace ventured into the room and heard faint voices but found no one there. Suddenly, she saw the door close, as if someone had just left. Overwhelmed with fear, she believed that intruders had entered their home. Grace gathered her helpers, Bertha, Lydia, and Mr. Tuttle, and asked them to open all the curtains in each room while she searched for the intruders. Ultimately, she found no one. However, in one of the mansion's rooms adorned with numerous pictures of previous owners, she discovered an album containing eerie photographs of people in a state resembling sleep. Startled, Grace was interrupted by Bertha knocking on the door. She inquired about the pictures and asked why the people appeared to be sleeping. Bertha explained that the subjects were actually deceased, and the photographs were post-mortem images. Feeling disgusted and horrified, Grace requested that Bertha dispose of the pictures. Overwhelmed by guilt and loneliness, Grace wept alone one night, yearning for her husband's presence. Once again, she heard unsettling voices and noises, prompting her to investigate. Guided by the sound, she cautiously entered the piano room, only to discover its emptiness. Bewilderingly, the door began opening and closing on its own, instilling terror within her. The forceful slam of the door knocked her to the floor, solidifying her belief that an otherworldly presence, a ghost she had previously denied, haunted their home. Despite Bertha's counsel to postpone meeting the priest until the weather improved, Grace unwaveringly insisted on seeking his assistance to bless the house, convinced of its haunting. On her way, she crossed paths with Mr. Tuttle, engrossed in his gardening duties. Urging him to explore the garden, Grace recounted her husband's mention of a graveyard on the premises and implored him to determine if a deceased child named Victor rested there. Having entrusted Mr. Tuttle with her request, Grace departed. In her absence, Bertha and Mr. Tuttle, displaying peculiar behavior, deliberately concealed a grave beneath a mound of fallen leaves. On her way to see a priest to ask for a blessing on her house, Grace found herself caught up in thick fog. Despite feeling uneasy, she sees her husband, who had finally returned home after being away for so long. Grace couldn't have been happier and was filled with excitement at the thought of introducing their children to their father again. However, Charles seemed different. She attributed it to the trauma he had experienced during the war. They all went home, and Bertha, the housekeeper, welcomed them. Grace busied herself with preparing dinner alongside Bertha, while Charles went upstairs to hug and kiss the children who had missed him dearly. During dinner, Charles didn't come downstairs to eat with them. Grace tried to understand that her husband needed some time and rest, so she let him be. Meanwhile, Grace and Anne, her daughter, found themselves in another argument about an intruder whom Anne insisted on seeing. In the next scene, Grace and Anne were trying on a white dress that had been made for Anne's upcoming communion day. Grace asked Anne to take it off so it wouldn't get dirty or damaged, but Anne was reluctant and asked to wear it a little longer. Grace agreed and decided to go check on her husband briefly, offering him comfort. When she returned to Anne, she noticed that her daughter was sitting on the floor, still wearing the dress, which irritated her. However, as she took a closer look, she noticed that the girl wearing the dress had wrinkled hands. Grace was filled with fright and slowly tried to examine the girl's face. To her horror, she saw the face of a creepy old woman underneath the veil, despite hearing Anne's voice. She demanded to know what the old woman had done to her daughter and lashed out in anger. Moments later, the figure of the old woman vanished. Anne burst into tears and unleashed her anger upon her mother, saying Grace wouldn't stop until they kill them. Bertha swiftly escorted Anne out of the room to offer her comfort, leaving Grace in a state of disbelief on she had just witnessed. Mrs. Mellis told Grace that she was unable to calm down Anne, so she decided to take her to her father. In the meantime, Bertha handed Grace pills, which intensified her growing unease and suspicion. Bertha attempted to reassure her by urging her to entrust matters to them, as they were aware of what needed to be done. However, Grace's distress heightened as she questioned Bertha's intentions, suspecting that she might be involved in something sinister. Overwhelmed and unable to trust anyone, she requested Mrs. Mellis to leave the room, and once alone, she disposed of the pills by discarding them in the sink. Charles confronted Grace, seeking answers about what Anne had disclosed to him. He referenced a specific day and questioned whether Grace was truly responsible for whatever had occurred. Grace, choosing not to deny it, assured Charles that their children were aware of her love for them. However, Charles reveals that he had returned merely to bid farewell to his wife and children before heading back to the battlefield to fight in the war. This revelation stirred a whirlwind of anger and pain within Grace, as she couldn't fathom his decision to prioritize the war over their family. Overwhelmed by her emotions, Grace lashed out at Charles, but soon they found solace in each other's arms, sharing a tender embrace. They made love, and while Grace slept, Charles left to fight again in war. Moments later, Grace heard her children screaming, causing her to immediately rush back inside the house. As she entered the kids' room, she discovered that the curtains had been removed, allowing sunlight to come in. Concerned for her children's well-being, she knew she had to act quickly and find a new location for them. However, as she moved from room to room, she realized that all the curtains in the house had disappeared. This revelation filled her with fear for her children and ignited her anger, as she wondered who could have done such a terrible thing and put her children at risk. Grace meticulously searched every inch of the rooms, exploring every possible spot and cabinet, but couldn't locate the missing curtains. In her distress, Grace called out for Bertha, one of the servants. The first person she encountered, however, was Lydia, and in her fury, Grace lashed out at the young lady, blaming her for the situation and insisting that she must know what was happening since it had also happened to her. Bertha, frustrated by Grace's treatment of Lydia, entered the room and intervened, putting a stop to Grace's anger. Mr. Tuttle happened to pass by, and Bertha turned to him for answers. Grace found the actions of the two servants suspicious, leading her to suspect that they were involved in the disappearance of the curtains and might have ulterior motives, such as trying to take control of the house. Filled with a mix of fear and determination, Grace retrieved her gun and pointed it at Bertha and Mr. Tuttle, demanding that they must leave. The three servants began to slowly exit the house. As they left, the servants expressed their frustration over Grace, mentioning that she had become unbearable to be around. They hinted at uncovering some graves. As the departing servants left, Grace's search continued, frantic and disorganized, covering every corner of the house except for one remaining area, the servants' room. To her utter horror, she stumbled upon a photograph inside Bertha and Lydia's room, revealing that the three servants were deceased, and the image was taken post-mortem. Grace found it impossible to believe what she was seeing. Meanwhile, Grace had confined Anne and Nicholas to a dark room she had prepared for them. Anne, driven by a foolish idea to search for their father, persuaded Nicholas to accompany her outside. During their journey, they discovered gravestones in the garden, which piqued Anne's curiosity. However, as the servants returned, Anne made a terrifying realization. The names on the gravestones matched those of the servants. Filled with fear, the children screamed and hurriedly retreated to the safety of the house. Grace, armed with a gun, shot at the approaching servants and barricaded the entrance to prevent their entry. Instructing the children to hide upstairs, Grace found herself confronted by the now revealed deceased servants, who disclosed that they had died from tuberculosis long ago. They pleaded with Grace to let them come inside. The servants cautioned Grace that she could not repel the intruders in the same manner she had dealt with them. Suddenly, the piercing screams of the children reached her ears again, and Bertha informed Grace that the intruders had found the children. Rushing upstairs, Grace entered the room and sees a gathering of individuals seated around a table. To her surprise, the old woman she saw wearing the veil was the same old woman conducting a séance, attempting to communicate with the deceased. Old woman urged Anne to reveal the truth of what had happened to them. It was finally unveiled that their own mother had smothered them, and Anne remembers the horrifying memory of her mother's actions. Now, Grace's memories of that fateful day flooded back. She recalled everything, how her husband's death in the war had plunged her into deep depression, leaving her utterly hopeless. She had taken the lives of her children and then her own. Bertha informs Grace that they had been trying to make her confront the truth from the very beginning. The intruders, as it turned out, were living individuals who had refrained from purchasing the house due to its being haunted. Grace asserted that no one could force them to leave the house.
Yeah.
Hello, beautiful people. It's Movie Pops Recap here. Thank you for coming across this YouTube channel. Please hit the subscribe and like button. That'll be much appreciated.